Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Sánchez, and I come from Mexico. And I'm really thankful for being here with everybody today, hoping that I can share a very different experience that you will see for the first 20 minutes won't have nothing to do with your context or your work or the strategy that was just presented, but rather contrary, it has to do with bad policy choices and a bad approach to a very different phenomena that has caused a lot of harm. I promise after those 20 minutes, for the very end of my presentation, there will be an underlying message of what are the challenges that we share and what are the common positions that we should value and take into account when being involved in the drugs issue, and particularly when being a practitioner trying to prevent, treat, or reduce the harms caused by drugs or drug policies themselves. So as Joha mentioned, I'm from Mexico City, and I'm very much sure that at least some of you have heard about Mexico, and probably the things you've heard about Mexico are not the best, and I'm gonna tell you exactly why. But first of all, I want to share my story with you. I was born in 1984, so I'm very much a child of my time. And that means that when I became socially active and I was in my teenage years, basically the cause that was there for us to fight for in terms of public health and social action was the HIV epidemic. I was raised in the 90s, got into university in the early 2000s, and basically my country was facing some of the challenges that Europe faced back in the 80s when the HIV epidemic came into Mexico, mostly through sexual contact, but also mostly through injecting drug use. So I became an activist in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And it was basically, I was basically an HIV activist. I even organized one of the largest conferences on HIV in the world in Mexico City in 2008. And I was very happy living my life that way because drugs were not necessarily a high priority or an agenda item at the national level. And we were definitely not facing a lot of problems when it came to drug abuse, or even drug trafficking, although there were drugs and there was drug trafficking even then. But what happened in my country specifically in 2006? Basically, a new government came on board and decided that the drugs issue was going to be the most important issue of the government, and that we're going to use every single power they had and every single agency they had to fight drugs, because drugs were perceived as evil, drugs were perceived as something terrible that needed to be eradicated from the country, but most importantly, drugs were a narrative and a policy choice that they chose to convince the entire country that we needed to do something, and that thing needed to be very extreme. So in 2006, the president took the military out to the streets in order to fight the drug cartels, and they basically used the entire law enforcement apparatus of the Mexican state to fight drugs, endorsing a narrative that was very, very dangerous for the health and for the human rights of people who use drugs, but not only, also for people that had nothing to do with drugs and that had never tried drugs in their lives and had nothing to do with drug trafficking. So that's basically my story. After seeing the consequences of such policy choices, I sort of became a drug policy activist, learning from the lessons of the harm reduction community that I had met in my previous years as an HIV activist. So this is the before and after of the country that I grew up in and that I developed and practiced my entire professional life. Before 2006, we had only 8 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. That may look like a lot to you, or countries like Japan, for example, that only have 1 per 100,000. But to Mexico, this was basically pretty good. It was the lowest homicide rate that we had had in our entire history as an independent country, and it all went really wrong after that. We had crime levels that were similar to the most continental European countries, and we only had between 7 and 12 cartels dedicated to transnational illicit trafficking. You can say 7 to 12 is a lot, but I'm going to show you the after in a few minutes. We used to have, and this is a very important number that I want you to keep in mind, we used to have only 42 cases of precautionary detention, which means that drug-related crimes were not considered particularly heinous crimes, and therefore it was not authorized for the state to violate due process guarantees or due process rights when detaining a person for drug offenses, and we had around 137 convictions for organized crime before choosing to fight a very deadly war on drugs. And our population used illegal drugs or used drugs. Legal drugs, yes, we have around 4 million people with alcohol problems in our country, up to 17 million youngsters that normally engage in binge drinking and could develop dependency to alcohol, that they are experiencing drug abuse. But in terms of illegal drugs, we only had 1.5% of our population that had tried once in their lifetimes one of the illegal drugs. And we had a prevalence of less 1% of the people that actually had developed a dependency to any illegal drugs. Only 10% of our treatment facilities had a physician back then, and this is a reality that sadly hasn't necessarily changed. This means that 9 out of 10 persons that seek treatment for drug abuse or drug dependency never actually got to see a doctor. It was basically help, like an individual to individual sort of help, basically based on the AA model, but that no psychologists, no professionals actually dealing with drug treatment. What happened just 5 years after we went the wrong way in terms of deciding to mix drug dependency, health issues, drug use with security, and particularly with national security, instead of mixing that with what you've done here in Finland, with social programs, with a family strategy, with a child-first strategy. What happened is that our reality deteriorated quite fast. So we were now counting over 300,000 people killed on this world, with over 300 criminal organizations now instead of just 7, with 8,000 cases of precautionary detention instead of just 42, with more population using drugs, although you can actually see that the augmentation of people using illegal drugs was not even that bad, and with a lot more drug offenses that we had in the previous years. So just for you to have an idea, we used to have around 60,000 drug offenses a year. Now we're counting almost 500,000 drug offenses per year. Where do I want to go with all of these numbers? Basically to the fact that we chose to have a drug policy in Mexico that was not based on human rights, that was not based on evidence, and that was not based on the very basic principles of care, treatment, prevention, and humanity. We didn't think about the humans that were involved in the drug trade or that were involved in drugs, in drugs issue. And drug use, but we actually rather just framed drugs as something that was completely inhuman and that needed to be eradicated using all the possible means. That what provoked was basically a sharp increase in torture and human rights violations against people who use drugs, against people who were dependent to drugs, but also against people that were just suspected to being participating either in the drug trade or in drug-related activities such as possession or consumption. Here, for example, you have all the law enforcement agencies that we have in the countries, the military, the Navy, the Attorney General's office, and the federal police, and you can actually see on the percentage side what was the percentage of human rights recommendations made by our National Commission on Human Rights to those agencies in terms of drug-related matters. So, for example, our Navy got almost 60% of the recommendations on human rights for torturing people that were suspected to have to do something with drugs, either users, possessors, or people involved in the drug chain in just 1 year. But the most important thing is that this particular narrative of drugs and people who use drugs or were related somehow to drugs being dangerous, being not welcoming, being unhuman, basically authorized also a very sharp increase in torture and malpractices while arresting people for drug offenses. And this is very important because it all began with a narrative. It all began with a policy choice authorizing abuses against people that had to do something with drugs that led to this. Before 2006, normally the police used to kick drug offenders only 10% of the times. After 2006, that went up to almost 40%. But the most shocking part of it is that we actually built infrastructure to torture drug users and possessors that went to 44% of those detained for drug offenses that suffered from electric shocks during the arrest process or during the prosecution process. I don't need to tell you that that led to a bunch of human rights violations, including the lack of access to evidence-based treatment, the lack of access to physicians, the lack of access to harm reduction services, but also that led to ill treatment or torture in treatment centers, and that also led to torture during arrest, and that also led to criminalization of very specific population, youngsters in particular, poor people in particular, immigrants in particular, and a lack of gender perspective that in Mexico, sadly, and we can't relate to the beautiful strategy that was just presented here, we still don't have that new generation of young men that are in charge of their families, that are empathic to women, that are sharing the burden of taking care of families and children in Mexico. So there is a lack of a gender perspective, not only in terms of treatment, prevention, evidence, information that we offer to women who are somehow involved in drugs or developing even a drug abuse problem, and we don't have these services to actually take care of them or the LGBTIQ community. But we were also creating all other sorts of problems like internal displacement or involuntary recruitment of children for organized crime-related activities, which I don't have to explain, had a great impact in families, in society in general, and also in institutions. So what are we seeing 15 years almost after this strategy was first launched? First, that in children and in young people, we're having not only the consequences and the harms of drugs themselves. I mean, kids are still exposed to drugs, and in particular to legal drugs like alcohol, and they still suffered from family disintegration, exclusion, stigma, expelling from schools, lack of services, lack of information, lack of adults that are responsible for them not suffering, those stories that were shared by my colleague before me, and have to deal with trauma alone, for example. But children in Mexico are now also being left orphans. forced to emigrate, forced into criminality, and refused basic services because normally we imposed also very strict sanctions to either their parents, their families, their communities, or themselves. Youngsters are also exposed to the harms of unchecked substance and violent illicit markets, but also exposed to criminal records because even though use is not criminalized by law in Mexico, they still get arrested and they still get criminal records just for using drugs without being proved either dependent or involved in criminal activities. And women are disproportionately punished by drug laws in Mexico, even if they're just users. And I will give you an example of a woman that we defended in my organization, and I will talk a bit more about the work and the progress we've made in order to tackle all of this. There was this woman that had nothing to do with drugs. She was not a user, but then her boyfriend actually got caught for drugs. He was a heavy user, and he got arrested, and he went to prison. Once in prison, because we have kind of like self-government in prisons in Mexico, and criminals are running prisons in Mexico, her boyfriend was forced to bring drugs into the prison. And who do you guess was the person that was forced to take drugs into that particular prison? This woman that we defended. The problem with this story is that by the time that she got arrested as well, and she went into a judicial process within the criminal justice system, she was actually punished more heavily than her boyfriend in the first place, without taking into account that gender perspective that would have reflected on her vulnerable situation as the primary caregiver and now the only responsible for sustaining their children, but also the fact that her boyfriend was the one that was involved in the drug trade and was a heavy user and was forcing her to bring drugs into a prison, and the fact that there were criminal organizations running a federal prison that were actually demanding of people from the outside to bring drugs inside. She got a sentence of over 10 years in prison, whilst her boyfriend actually got a sentence of just 3 years. So this lack of gender perspective was causing a lot of harm. For men, evidently, I don't need to say this, men are being killed at an alarming rate in Mexico City, and the life expectancy of young men in Mexico has already decreased 1 year because of the homicide epidemic linked to the way that we chose to respond to drugs. But that's the sad part of it. The actually joyful part of being involved in this particular horrendous reality is that civil society actually stood up. And civil society documented all of these evidence, and civil society went again to the streets and went out again to look for drug users, and went out to look for their families, and went out to look for practitioners, and documented good practices like the ones that we found in Europe and other countries, and started fighting a very interesting fight. Particularly in my organization, we work as a toolbox. We don't work with very fixed programs, but we actually have 6 main functions and 3 main objectives. Our functions are policy, community empowerment, advocacy, education, strategic litigation, and assistance, because we actually help the victims of heavy crime in Mexico. We also provide some sort of orientation to people looking for information in regards to drugs. And we work on 3 main issues: security, justice, and human rights. My work on drug policy basically sits on the human rights track, and it has some components of the 6. So what did we do in order to reshape the situation in Mexico, and in order to bring back some sense to the discussion, for us to include yet again those basic principles of humanity, to treat the people that needed treatment, to provide assistance to those in need, but also to start linking drug policy to the other policies that needed to be linked to, like children, like social services, like institutions, like rule of law, etc., etc. We basically organized, and I am actually very, very proud that my organization is 75% led by young people under 30 years old. And we organized and we created a strategy. And the first thing that we needed to do was to change the narrative. Yes, drugs are risky. Drugs can be deadly, and drugs need to be prevented from using. And people who use drugs need treatment, and we should aspire to a society that does not abuse from drugs. Yes, sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in order to get to that society, we need to eradicate drug users from the face of the earth, and that doesn't mean that we should be punishing them or incarcerating them or neglecting them the basic services that they need other than treatment, like education, like housing, like other public services. So we basically engage in public opinion efforts and campaigns in order to decrease the negative perspective and the negative opinions of society as a whole in regards to drug users and in regards to what needed to be done in order to treat those in need. So what we did, for example, when we first started, there was over 90% of Mexicans that believed that drug users should be punished and that they weren't deserving of other public services because why taxpayers should pay for services to people who decide to harm themselves, right? So we started changing that narrative, and right now we have a tide of 50% people that actually believe that drug users should not be incarcerated and that drug users should be mostly supported. We advocated as well, and we advocated for families to unite and then demand the basic services that the state was neglecting. So now families in Mexico are fighting for not only better drug laws, but also for better services. Treatment centers that actually have facilities adapted for women. Basic services of, taking care of the children of the people that want to engage in treatment but have nobody else to take care of their babies, of their children, of the elderlies. And we started litigating as well. What are we defending? Cases like the case of Maria, this woman that I told you about, that she was punished and sentenced to spend 10 years in prison. We also litigated for Mexican prisons to have treatment services. We also litigated for injecting drug users to have free methadone, available services, harm reduction, infrastructure, and we're basically winning. And this is the underlying message. Out of 47 cases that we started defending by introducing just the human rights perspective into all of these madness that I told you during the first slides, we actually got some very good sentences coming from the judicial system in Mexico. First of all, treatment in prison settings should be a right and should be widely available and should be evidence-based with the support of physicians. Access to harm reduction services should not be neglected. People injecting drugs should have access to opiate substitution treatment like methadone. These should be free or should be taken care of by the state. And people should also have access to safe consumption sites. So in 3 cities in Mexico now, we have safe consumption rooms for people injecting drugs. Stigma and discrimination against people who use drugs in publicity and campaigns effort should not be permitted. And this was because there was a politician in Mexico that wanted to be mayor of Mexico City that basically built his entire political campaign on discriminating cannabis users. And we were opposed to that, and we won the case, and basically nobody can right now in Mexico have publicity or run a campaign upon discriminating a specific group of people, in particularly not those that are actually in need of public services like health services. No exclusion from education, because of course the main response in our education system was to expel students once they were found to be using drugs or having parents using drugs, and then we just perpetuated the cycle of stigma, discrimination, and neglect. Access to medicines included controlled medicines. We also litigated that, and we also litigated the need for the state to supervise treatment centers so we could avoid torture of people in need of treatment. We created a new momentum for discussing drug policy. So right now we have around 56 bills being discussed in Congress on how to have a more comprehensive, better drug policy, including prevention, treatment, harm reduction, social reinsertion, and all the connections amongst different policies in order to have a better track of what the individual needs are. And we have created new obligations for the Mexican state using the Inter-American Human Rights Court. All that to say that we began with a terrible reality in which drug use, drug users, and the drug trade were neglected. Then it became the public enemy #1 of our government, and we created even more problems that we had at the very beginning of this journey. But the most important thing is that over these past 12 years, what we're learning again, relearning, is that drug policies and attention to people who use drugs and have developed a dependency to any drug, whether legal or illegal, it's about compassion. It's about the humans behind it. It's about the individuals. It's about families. It's about communities. It's about right, dignity, care, love. And so I stole this heart from the harm reduction conference in Porto that was just held a couple of weeks ago, because it reminded me that we as a community at the international level, whether in Finland, whether in Mexico, whether in Latin America, should never forget that what we do, it's about individuals, it's about safer communities, it's about healthier families, it's about better institutions, and it's about better services. And I really hope that me sharing the story of how a country went incredibly wrong and on the other direction helps you to remain positive and continue to build better services, better strategies, and better policies for your own people here in Finland. And I truly hope that I can learn a lot from you, and that you can share your experiences with us so we don't repeat these mistakes again. Thank you very much.